The Hound was never meant to be a hero. Born in the shadow of a monster and forged in fire, Sandor Clegane learned early that pain is permanent and justice is a lie. Half his face was burned away by the brother the world calls a knight, and the boy who screamed in the flames grew into the Hound, a brutal killer who swore he believed in nothing. Yet somewhere between serving a sadistic king, protecting a stubborn girl, and facing the fire one last time, Sandor's life twisted into something far more dangerous than a villain's tale. To truly understand the entire life of the Hound, we have to go back to the very beginning. Sandor was born as the second son of House Clegane, a small landed house sworn to the Lannisters of Casterly Rock, growing up in the shadow of his monstrously large elder brother Gregor, and under a Lord Father who either cannot or will not control Gregor's violence. From an early age, Sandor is physically large and strong for his age, but nowhere near his brother's freakish size, and he learns very quickly that raw strength is no protection against Gregor's cruelty when no one in the household dares to oppose the heir to the house. The defining trauma of Sandor's childhood comes when he is a boy playing with a wooden knight that Gregor has discarded, which Gregor suddenly decides is stealing, and punishes by shoving Sandor's face into a burning brazier until flesh and hair char, leaving half of Sandor's face melted and his scalp and ear horribly deformed. Their father covers up the incident by spreading a lie that Sandor's bedding caught fire, which teaches Sandor that his pain will be denied to protect Gregor and the family's reputation, and that knights and fathers who should stand for protection and justice will instead look away from monstrous cruelty. As Sandor grows into his teens, he hardens around this injury, becoming a sullen, bitter youth with a deep terror of fire and an equally deep hatred of knighthood, which he now associates with Gregor's later anointing and with the hypocrisy of lords who praise Gregor's prowess and ignore his crimes. He develops into a brutally efficient fighter whose style relies on direct, overwhelming violence rather than chivalric flourish, and he begins to see the world in very simple, cynical terms. The strong take what they want, the weak suffer, and vows and pretty words are lies that powerful men use to dress up their appetites. As a young man, Sandor enters Lannister service and becomes the personal sworn sword of Prince Joffrey Baratheon, bringing him into King's Landing and the royal court, but notably never taking knighthood despite his skill. Serving Joffrey forces Sandor to channel his rage and talent for killing into protecting a cruel boy he despises, reinforcing his belief that the world rewards monsters and that a man like him has no honest place except as a blade for hire. At the Hands tourney in King's Landing, Sandor publicly saves Ser Loras Tyrell from Gregor's murderous rage after Gregor is unhorsed, stepping between his gigantic brother and the unarmored knight and proving he is one of the few living warriors who can face Gregor without flinching. Robert Baratheon's command halts the duel before it turns lethal, leaving Sandor with his hatred for Gregor sharpened and unresolved, and strengthening his conviction that the crown will always pull back before allowing true justice for what Gregor did to him as a child. When the Lannisters move against the Starks after Robert's death, Sandor rides as part of the Lannister host and participates in brutal foraging and intimidation, using the fearsome dog-helmed armor that makes the Hound a symbol of terror throughout the Riverlands. Acting as royal enforcer during Joffrey's reign, he carries out orders like beating and threatening citizens or overseeing public cruelty, which further blackens his name and forces him to live as the very kind of monster he believes the world has made him. Sandor's first major crack away from that role comes during the Battle of the Blackwater, when wildfire explodes across the river in siege lines, turning the night sky and the sea green and sending men burning and screaming around him, which triggers his childhood trauma and overwhelms his ability to function. Shaken and terrified in a way the court has never seen, he walks out of the throne room in open defiance of Joffrey, throws down his cloak and service, and tells the boy king and everyone present that they can all go to ruin without him, choosing at last to abandon both King's Landing and the Lannisters rather than face the fire again. Fleeing the city, Sandor stumbles onto Arya Stark among the war's chaos and takes her captive, planning to ransom her to her family, which marks the beginning of a long, involuntary partnership that steadily exposes humanity under his brutal exterior. On the road through the Riverlands, he shows Arya both his cruelty and his rough practicality, killing without hesitation when threatened, but also protecting her from worse men, explaining to her in blunt terms how lords and knights use people like tools, and how small folk are crushed between great houses. At the twins, Sandor arrives during or just after the Red Wedding and witnesses the betrayal against the Starks, seizing the chance to snatch Arya away from the slaughter outside the castle and preventing her from charging to a pointless death. From that point, the two become fugitives, moving through a devastated countryside, and Sandor repeatedly risks himself to keep Arya alive, motivated at first by the hope of a ransom at the Vale, but gradually by a grudging attachment to her stubbornness and refusal to break. Their road ends temporarily at the Eyrie when Sandor learns that Lysa Arryn, Arya's last living relative he hoped to sell her to, has died, destroying his hope of payment and pushing him into bitter despair at yet another turn of bad fortune. Soon after, Sandor fights Brienne of Tarth in a vicious, exhausting duel over Arya's fate, is beaten and left with shattered bones and mortal wounds at the edge of a cliff, and begs Arya to kill him, but she walks away, leaving him to die and forcing him to confront the terror of a slow, lonely death he has inflicted on others. Sandor survives his wounds and is found by a rural religious community devoted to simple labor and peace, under the leadership of the former warrior brother Ray, who nurses Sandor back from the edge of death. Forced into a life of quiet work, chopping wood, building, sharing meals, Sandor experiences, perhaps for the first time, days not defined by killing or orders, and Brother Ray challenges his belief that a violent past fixes who a man must be by insisting that a person can still choose what kind of man to be with the time that remains. When raiders massacre the entire community in Sandor's absence, leaving Brother Ray hanged and the villagers butchered, Sandor reverts to violence but with a new motive. Not pay, not orders, but personal vengeance for people who had given him kindness and asked nothing in return. Tracking down and executing the killers, he then encounters the Brotherhood without banners, and instead of being an unthinking sellsword, he negotiates and walks away with them, beginning to move in the direction of a man who chooses his own causes rather than serving a lord's. Later, Sandor joins Jon Snow and others on the desperate ranging beyond the wall to capture a White, facing his greatest fear when he must move across frozen, firelit battlefields and stand on breaking ice surrounded by undead in order to help convince the living to unite. Terrified by the fire, yet still fighting alongside the others, he proves to himself that his life is no longer ruled entirely by the brazier from his childhood, because he can now choose to endure the terror for a purpose larger than his own survival. In the final march on King's Landing, Sandor travels with Arya into the burning city, but stops her inside the Red Keep, insisting that if she goes any farther, she will destroy herself with vengeance the way he has spent his entire life, and he urges her, for once, to choose life and walk away instead. Only after Arya turns back does Sandor go on alone to confront Gregor in the crumbling stairwells of the Red Keep, fulfilling years of hatred and fear, in a brutal fight that neither man can truly win, because Gregor's altered body barely feels pain, and Sandor knows he cannot escape. Realizing that nothing, not his skill, not his rage, can kill this unnatural version of his brother except the thing he fears most, Sandor drives them both off the tower and into the inferno below, choosing to embrace fire and death if it means finally dragging Gregor down with him. In that final act, Sandor becomes exactly what the title Hound never allowed him to be, a man who chooses his own end for a reason he believes in, turning a life shaped by a brazier and a monster brother into a death that breaks their bond in fire on his own terms.